right, so hello everyone. Welcome to the last global development seminar of the year, I think. Yes, and it's my great pleasure to introduce myself, basically, to this last seminar. So I would like to introduce myself together with a bunch of comrades, friends and partners in crime. I'm extremely pleased to present this project, which has a very long history, as we will hear. The presentation will be based on an article that just came out in the International Feminist Journal of Politics, but that has a life of its own now in the development of a much broader network that we will hear of in a moment. I'm Alessandra Mezzadri. I am a reader in global development and political economy in the Department of Development Studies here at SOAS. And I have the great pleasure to introduce the panel that I'm going to be part of this evening. Shirin Rai, who's this distinguished research professor in our Department of Politics, and the authors of far too many great stuff for me to acknowledge, but I will pinpoint their last great contribution was the book Depletion by Oxford University Press, which some of these themes are touched upon in the presentation and the articles we are about to hear from. Then I have Sara Stevano, who's a senior lecturer in the Department of Economics here at SOAS, another partner in crime across, far too many sort of projects that I can acknowledge, but also, and also very prolific writer. I will mention the last publication, which is a must get, which is the Feminist Political Economy, a Global Perspective, that is published by Columbia University Press and Agenda, yes, in the UK. So fantastic learning resource to know more about some of the approaches that we are speaking of today. And finally, we to present myself together with my panel. Asma Abdi, who is a lecturer in politics of the Middle East at the University of Exeter. Such a treat that she can be with us today to act as a discussant for our paper. We're very grateful, especially because of the long journey that she faces. Asma's work can be read across a variety of academic journals, but for a last contribution, please do check the International Feminist Journal of Politics. So how we're going to organize this, we have a presentation which is shared. Shirin will start off, I will follow, and then Sara will complete the presentation in parts. We will talk all together about the significance, how we see the significance of this piece, and then Asma will offer some discussant notes. So without further ado, I'll just first have Shirin coming here. Thank you.
Oh, hello everyone. Thank you for coming on the last day of the term. People want to be liberated of institutions on these days, so we are very grateful. As Alexandra has said, we started writing this paper in theory many moons ago, 2 years ago. COVID did many things to us, but one thing that it also did was convert loneliness into solidarity, and which is what happened with us. I was reading Tithi Bhattacharya's really interesting book on social reproduction theory by myself in, under lockdown. and feeling some discomfort, though I learned a lot from that as well, about the North centricity of our theorizations. And so basically, I just picked up the phone to Alessandra and said, would you like to discuss this with me? And she said, yeah, but I think Sara would be really good as well to discuss. And I said, well, I've got a couple of colleagues at Warwick who would also really like to be. And before we knew, we were about, 12, 15 of us. And that also was personally really wonderful for me because, of course, I have made friends during that period, which then who I depended on when I came to SOAS. And so we met throughout COVID every month, and we discussed various questions and papers. And out of that conversation grew this paper, really. It elaborated sort of, our understanding of social reproduction itself. It extended it, it expanded it, it made us look elsewhere for our inspiration to think about different ways of life making, that is social reproduction. Which led to, when I first came to SOAS in 2022, a workshop, which was funded by SOAS, so one of the funding pots. And we came together together, and it became almost like it was a fantastic occasion, 2 days of constant engagement. At the end of it, we were all very tired but joyous, and shared many critiques and knowledges and disciplinary standpoints and collective understandings and different understandings of over generations of scholars and scholars from all over the world. So the outcome of this workshop, which was so generative of so many of our ideas, some of which you will hear, was this article that we wrote. And the title of the article is the title of our seminar today, Pluralising Social Reproduction Approaches. And that has sort of, that workshop also led to the establishment of the network, and that is our network, and it's a really beautiful website, so please go and visit it if you want to know more about the network. But really, our work seeks to, in short, pluralize social reproduction approaches. By eschewing any single theory, that was the idea of approaches. And I remember sitting in the SCR and talking with Sara and Alessandra, and we were saying, well, there's such a fetish of theorizing, and what theory means. And we'd like to just open up that box and think about it in terms of different approaches, which also allows us to not to critique other approaches, but not to overlook them. We are also an interdisciplinary network, and the paper actually reflects that. There were geographers, there were lawyers, there were economists, there were political economists, there were straight political scientists, there were Middle East experts, there were people working on Kenya, there were people working on South Africa, there were people working on the Middle East, I've already said. So it was multi-sited and an interdisciplinary group that we established, and we continue to work together. So that allowed us to think very carefully about the importance of location as a way of understanding life making. And you will hear more about that from Alessandra in a minute. But really, what we wanted to do and what the ethos of our work is that we want to celebrate analyses of social reproduction from across the world. We felt that, which has been written about before, that sometimes we talk about, or we talk in a vocabulary that is not recognized across the world. social reproduction, I've always felt that is a challenge to feminists to come up with a word which is not care, but also not social reproduction, which is, is not a very, it's such a jargonistic word in my view. But it is an important view because important word because, or concept because of course it allows us to talk about some things and not others. So the boundary making, however porous, is also important. So we build from and through location. That is one of our ways of thinking about it. And we set up sort of, many possible research agendas, many possible approaches, but talking to each other within that broad framework of social reproduction. How is location central to our understanding? Location is central to our understanding through geography, through geopolitics, through history of colonialism, through socialities of different kinds. And these have sort of implications for us, if you think about social reproduction in this way, for our methodologies and also our epistemologies. So in the next bit, which Anna is going to take over now, I hope that we will be able to outline some of our key concepts and arguments and convince you.
All right. So thanks, Shirin, for putting out there the argument in a nutshell, which is a very simple argument. So when we look at social reproduction, this is not a theory. I'll just get you through why I think this is a very important claim. And then location is a key way in which we can instead pluralize the concept. Before we do that, because we presented so nice pictures for our workshop, I really want to thank all those that were involved in the ideas that form the backbone of this paper. Besides, of course, us three, this could have not been possible without the participants in that workshop. So thank you to Donatella Alessandrini, Anna Bargawi, Juanita Elias, Shirin Hassin, Surbi, who just arrived. Hello, Surbi. Jayanti Tiaya Lingam, Serena Natile, Nita, and Lynn Hossome, Parvati Raghuram, Georgie Zicata, who's also in the Department of Development Studies, and Stephanie Wall. So these were the magic, the MBA, and we're very sort of grateful that they were a part of our discussions. So I'll start from, because the argument is really not it can be reduced in a sense to its backbone, but there's a level of complexity beyond each of these bits. So starting on why we think to make the argument that this should not be seen as a theory, I think is very important. And I would say that we shall start with the sort of origins of the term social reproduction, its evolution, and its sort of point of arrival to a variety of theories which in themselves are already quite different. So when we talk about the term social reproduction, which had this renaissance in the last 10 years, we talk about something that already the physiocrats used. So as early as the 17th century, we found in the work of François Quesnel the reference to social reproduction simply to refer to the social classes in society. And after that, of course, there's a very strong sort of anchoring to the term, to the work of Marx, which actually makes reference to the concept both in Capital as well as in the Grundrisse, with the idea of making the link between the inequalities, the transmission of inequality, and the regeneration of labor power. But it's only in the 1970s that we see the term being reappropriated instead by the feminists, and in the context particularly of the domestic labor debate, 1972 onwards, we see that this has given the analytical weight that we still give it now today. So the idea of centering unpaid labor or the work of reproduction is central to the entire edifice of capitalism. So in the words of Maria Rosa Dalla Costa and Selma James, the fact that capitalism doesn't start in the factories, but starts in the kitchen and the bedrooms, or from the reproductive ghettos, these are the words they used, and so shall study it from there. Now, the early social reproduction analysis theorists from the 1970s onwards were particularly concerned with the role of the home in the concealment of unpaid labor contributions and the home as a unit of oppression itself. And I would say that great literature has evolved from there, but of course you can already get a sense that it's a very North-centric literature that takes the experiences of a specific cohorts of women as the point of reference for theorizing. In the last 10 years, when we talk about social reproduction, which much more used to refer to the work of P.P. Bhattacharya, Susan Ferguson, and others, in what is known as social reproduction theory. And here I would say, want to simplify perhaps, but it's more of an vantage point that focuses on a theory of reproductive governance, if we want, and concerned with institutions of social reproduction and care, health and education in premise, and also the way in which financial capitalism and the neoliberalism has reorganized the way in which we live. Now, while of course these bodies of work are very important to flip, if you want, the study of capitalism from one that starts from production to one that starts from life, where we should really start, right? You need to live in order to labor at the very basic level of analysis. Otherwise, you have, in the words of David McNally, this male worker that lives through a mythology of self-birth. It just appears out of nowhere, right? So these are very important bodies of work, but at the same time, we really feel also in SRTs, in fact, I would say especially in SRT, the weight of the North-centric reference of the theorizations, the concept of crisis of care or crisis of reproduction in response to the neoliberalization of welfare is, of course, a very North-centric understanding of what the crisis of reproduction is. So there are quite interesting, there have always been insightful points of critique of this, both the early theorization as well as the later one, but primarily set by Black feminists. They're already coming from either settler colonies or the global north itself. So very famous was the critique by Angela Davis of the early social reproduction framework, and instead we have the work of Nina Banks, for instance, with reference to critiques of SRT. But when we just adopt a different view that is centered on the global south, even these criticisms are perhaps limited in a sense that the very unit of analysis that we make reference to in this theorization, that might be households, what constitutes labor, communities, welfare, subjectivities are actually imbued of very different meanings altogether. So we need to be very attentive to not impose forms of epistemic violence when we decide social reproduction instead is X, Y, and Z, which is decided in other contexts. And we can provide very strong critiques to both these two frameworks. For instance, the fact that in the early social reproduction analysis, the centrality of the home as a unit of oppression doesn't speak to, indeed, for instance, instead, instances where the home was instead the only arena of freedom or protection against state violence, like it happens for Black communities in the United States and beyond, or indeed as it's happening in the context of the current Palestinian genocide. There are writers like Maitaha that's just reminding us of this. The same goes with social reproduction theory in relation to, I say, the crisis, or even the ways in which specific forms of precarity and exploitations which diverge from the wage labor classic nexus occur, which might be seen as how is it called? I'm a labor studies person. So atypical forms of employment in this neck of the wood, what is called the reality of labor in the rest of the majority world. So it is a question of grammar, I would say, but also a question of how you reach out. If you want to be able to tell the story of capitalism otherwise, from a point of view of life, how we build the solidarities which are epistemic as well as theoretical as well as political, it's not a small question to ask. So how we capture life making in a way that does not really set the histories of some as sort of hierarchically superordinate to the history of others. So the idea of pluralizing social reproduction approaches comes from this mix of, I would say, sensitivities, theoretical imperatives, and political compulsion that we sort of felt in different ways, in this extremely diverse community that we started being part of during lockdown and beyond. And I want to be very clear here. There are many different ways that these projects could have gone ahead. I think we have to be humble in even our attempts to sort of create a project which is inclusive, because sometimes when we pitch the project as the only way forward towards that specific path to inclusions, we risk to be exclusionary nevertheless. So we don't claim that our way to pluralize is the only way at all, but it is one way, and we chose location, I think, also in response to our own subject location as a very diverse group of people that are spread geographically across the globe. So location is one of the ways in which you can pluralize social reproduction approaches. And why location was important for us was because it just spoke to diversity in the way in which we can observe processes of life making in three different ways. One related to geography, one related to history, and one related then to social relations as an implication of the first two. So at the very basic level of analysis, geography is not secondary complication to nothing, as we hopefully learn at SOAS. I see all my students before me, so I hope you got the message. So the geographies of life making are very complex and also very different, depending on which area we look at. Very simple example would be to compare the urban and the rural, but also within the rural and within the global south, the centrality, not so much necessarily of the home all the time, but rather land and rather agroecologies and context that instead perhaps are less highlighted with reference to the literature in the global north. Then histories, which histories we narrate when we set the beginning of oppression from the domestic sphere, right? Pramila Nadasen, in a fantastic book that just came out this year, starts from the consideration that to understand exploitation by reproductive work, you need to start from the home as well as you need to start from the colony, because these two tropes they have to go together to narrate the history of so many different communities. And with reference to history, colonial and imperial projects have been fundamental to shape not just social reproduction as it was experienced during these encounters, but also how they continue being reproposed in our global present. So, of course, then the social relations of reference follow from that. Now, location is very different from localizing, and this we had a very interesting discussions with the reviewers of our paper, in fact, that perhaps were more used to the classic Fordist, post-Fordist debate around globalizing versus localizing, but we did feel that it spoke to how some of these debates have been dealt with and sort of analyzed before. So on the one hand, the work of Gibson Graham on local diverse economies, pushing towards a sort of assemblage of diverse economies that could have been like a way in which this project could evolve. That was not our project. And at the same time, it was not also our intention to point at a global ontology with variegated forms, because then you risk to sort of regenerate a number of hierarchies. This would be more the project by Isabella Bacher and Stephen Gill, who have a great special issue on Capital and Class, if you're interested in what they try to do there. So something in between, in a sense that we want to clarify that the way in which location shapes different forms of life making is not just diverse and it is co-constitutive and coeval and it co-structures than the global in a similar way to what argued by Parvati Raghuram with reference to care regimes. So we define these pluralizing social reproduction approaches that we propose, and here I'm quoting from the paper, is working through and celebrating manifold ontological and material complexities of social reproduction across the world as coeval, coexisting, co-constitutive, and globally articulated. So that follows that social reproduction approaches, the way in which we use it in the paper, is that approaches that focus broadly on the regeneration of life making as entangled with trajectories and experiences of capitalism worldwide. So methodologically, how we do that, then my sister in crime, Sara Stevano, would just talk about.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk you through, or take you through rather, some of the key methodological questions that we have been discussing. And for some reasons, in the many collaborative projects that Alessandra was mentioning in the beginning, I end up being the methods person. So, but I'm very happy to operate with this hat. I mean, of course, everybody else here is equally knowledgeable on the topic, but I suppose one reason why I'm particularly interested in methodological questions is that, so I work very much across disciplines, but my main discipline is economics, and this is a discipline where methodologies are basically, like barely discussed unless you are in a heterodox department like the one that we have here at SOAS. So I think particularly from that perspective, for me, it's quite significant to think about methodology and method. But coming to us and trying to connect some of these methodological questions with what Ale and Shirin talked about in terms of our project. The first thing I want to say is that, so clearly, in our attempt to sort of throw a stone towards the building of a pluralizing social reproduction approaches research agenda, then to think about what kind of methodological approaches are needed, what kind of methods are needed is very key if we want to have a lot of people trying to do this type of research. And something to be said about this is that I think that so far there's not much that has been written very explicitly and in a systematic way about methodology and method in social reproduction feminism. In general. So the type of knowledge that we have needs to be basically inductively gathered from what a variety of scholars do in practice. And so, like in this project, as well as others that I collaborated particularly with Alessandra with, this is, like at the beginning of this work on methodological questions. So try to understand, okay, what do people do in practice? What are the lessons learned? And how do we take this forward, so to speak? So in this particular paper, in the methodology section, we make first a point about how social reproduction tends to be conceptualized as a totality of work and material social practices that are needed for the regeneration of life. And I think that this is cross-cutting across the social reproduction literature. And so in this sense, a useful starting point from a methodological perspective is to think about those approaches, particularly Marxist thinking, that see capitalist or capitalist life or capitalism as a totality as well. And on this point, actually, like it is quite useful because Alessandra edited a volume called Marx in the Field, where some of these, methodological and method questions are talked about explicitly from a Marxist perspective. And so, there are clearly a lot of, there are many lessons that I think can be learned, although then extended from a feminist perspective, from those kind of approaches. Now, the second thing is that another cross-cutting theme, and the students who were in my class this morning know this already. It seems that from a feminist lens, a way of thinking about methodology must include multiscalarity and multitemporality. Mm-hmm. So it seems to be very important to try to connect different scales, particularly when we think about the local and the global, which again, it might be perhaps more obvious in certain disciplines across the social sciences. It's not obvious at all in my discipline of economics, where there is a clear separation between the microeconomic and the macroeconomic, but this is a side point. And in terms of multitemporality, social reproduction approaches are very much about everyday life and everyday practices, and also intergenerational practices. So these are different temporal levels. And I think that, and this is a point that Alessandra made very well before, there is an additional step in thinking in historical terms and in seeing how, for example, the history of colonialism has created specific forms of global division of labor that are centered on multiple inequalities in terms of how both reproductive and productive work has been distributed and allocated. So these are two important methodological principles, if you want, that we think that a social reproduction approaches type of research agenda should foreground, multiscalarity and multitemporality. And then another point that we begin to make, although probably there's more that needs to be said about this, is that from a methodological and analytical perspective, although we think that the social reproduction as a totality is an appropriate way of conceptualizing social reproduction, there might be something that could be gained if we broke down methodologically and analytically the concept of social reproduction into specific forms of social reproductive work, or even resources that are needed for social reproduction. So on this, there is still very little, but if we think about resources such as food, water, education, healthcare, social care, and even basic infrastructure, I think that there's something to be gained in our understanding of all of these topics if we were to use explicitly a social reproduction lens. And that would mean methodologically, doing this exercise of breaking the concept of social reproduction down and saying, okay, I recognize that it's a totality, but I'm going to look at, in my case, I have an interest in food, for example, and I think that there is something to be gained both from a social reproduction and a food perspective in, putting these different research agendas in explicit dialogue. So this is another point that we make in the paper. And then when it comes to specific methods, we do not say anything that is overly specific, but if we sort of go back to this broader feminist point that what matters in the use of methods is how they are applied rather than the specific method that is used. So, methods can be used in feminist ways. Most of them, perhaps not all of them. There are certain methods such as randomized control trials that might not be very compatible with a feminist research agenda, but many other methods probably, can somehow be used in a feminist way. And again, probably, the way in which we can turn certain methods into feminist tools for data collection is through, this principle of capturing multiple scales, multiple temporalities, and through the methodological principle of reflexivity, which is something that feminists have been writing about for decades. And finally, we make a point about time use because, I mean, even if we probably think, and that's the point of the paper, that a social, pluralizing social reproduction approaches is about using more, different data from time use only as the main data to study social reproduction. But time use de facto remains a key source of data in order to understand how we organize our daily life and how we can capture also reproductive work and so forth. And of course, there is a lot that can be learned from time use survey data, but we also recognize the limitations of this data in obscuring certain aspects of time and time use. And therefore, we make a point for the use of qualitative and mixed method techniques to study time, as well as many other, relevant things, and to, have an approach to time use data that is more theoretically rich and grounded, which often is missing in the studies on time use that tend to be quite descriptive at the end of the day. So this is what I had on methods, and I think on this note we can move to the conclusion of our presentation by talking about the significance, and I know that each of us has something to say, so maybe I'll go back to my seat and then one of you can start. Yeah.
Okay, so we do have final sections, of course. We look at the implications of this for solidarities and politics, and I'll say a few words about that. But I think I first want to start with what has been driving me towards an engagement with social reproduction at very different levels. And for me, it's a desire to tell capitalist history otherwise. So to actually work theoretically and to show how much theoretical work can actually inform the way in which we narrate the history of us and of our planet in very different ways. So for me, it's been a very compelling project for this reason. Now, if this is the project, and I guess that's definitely one of the driving forces behind my intellectual labor. I can only see this happening once we do not only focus on certain stories. So the idea to flip capitalist, the story of capitalism on its head, to move from production to reproduction, will always be an incomplete project if then we only focus on the histories or the reproductive histories of certain regions vis-a-vis others. We simply replicate the type of hierarchy which already dominate mainstream ways in which political economy is formed. So the ethos and objectives of the project at the broader level of analysis for me remains this, but then has knock-on effects of all different types, because politically, to me, the significance of focusing on life is this process of multiplications of potential revolutionary subjects that then at this point we literally find everywhere, not just in the factory, but we find it in on the street, on the warehouse, in the home, in the clinic, everywhere. And of course, then we multiply the ways in which we can think about struggle from the point of view of the reproductive as opposed to the productive, and also how we can then think about articulating solidarities in many different ways. So if I have to just really speak about the significance of this, then of course still speaks to this desire to articulate, to connect, to sort of stand with, which again, I don't think only social reproduction analysis necessarily have. There are a number of frameworks that are trying to tell a similar stories from a different standpoints, the colonial frameworks, but this is, I would say, the neck of the wood where I'm comfortable with. And again, there is a way to reach out still to these theorizations that have still the same desire to tell the history of the world otherwise and to rethink the ways in which this can lead to solidarities and social justice.
So, well, you put it so beautifully.
Yeah.
Thank you. Don't think I need to add very much more, but my kind of location in terms of theorizing and approaches of social reproduction has been twofold. One is to think about it in terms of what is overlooked and what are the costs of that overlooking. And so the work that I've done with Catherine Hoskins, who turned 90 last week, and Dania Thomas on depletion is from that position, sort of, that overlooking the perspectives that we bring to the table in order to understand life making has costs. It's not costless. And if it is not costless, how do we methodologically understand that? And there, my own understanding and what I want to kind of develop more with within this framework is of the everyday. So Juanita Elias and I have done some, who's also one of the authors of this paper from Warwick, we have done some work to try and understand how social reproduction unfolds in our everyday and how locationally that is diverse, but then we need to understand it in order to change it, right? So that is my second kind of motivation to understand the everyday unfolding of social reproduction in ways that looks at the costs of it as well as how to mitigate these costs. I think also the third and the final thing I would say is that this experiment, if you want to call it, or this initiative for us to try and broaden our perspective, not to attack anybody, not to sort of dismiss any other perspective, but to broaden our own perspective and our own thinking of social reproduction, is to do with politics. And so as not just as a political scientist, but as fundamentally as a feminist, I want to make things better. And one of the ways in which we can improve things is to think about solidarity. How do we reach across differences of approaches, differences, theories, different locations, different geographies, histories, what we have been talking about? Because without that, it is impossible to make change happen. So I just want to read a bit from the paper in which we say that pluralizing social reproduction approaches then is the first step towards identifying the multiple and heterogeneous ways in which the production of life is structured and operates under global capitalism, and towards developing solidarities that are able to challenge capitalist oppressions and reclaim social reproduction. Because fundamentally, solidarity has to be symmetrical, mutual, and a reciprocal relation.
Right. I don't know how much I can add in terms of the significance, but let me maybe try with a couple of points. So starting with Alessandra before said very clearly, the point of the paper is very simple, but I want to really emphasize the importance of making this argument because I do feel that there is a lot of theorizing that is implicitly informed by realities, experiences, voices in the global north, and in fact sometimes not even the entirety of the global north, but a handful of countries and contexts in the global north. And then this is not even explicitly recognized, right? And then we take this theorizing as being universal. So I think that, again, while I think the panel and the people involved in the paper demonstrate very clearly that social reproduction is very interdisciplinary, and I think that this should remain in that way. But again, I feel that in my own discipline of economics, that it's a form of epistemic violence, like of theorizing that is almost exclusively informed by, like a global north perspectives and so forth, is very, very entrenched. And so for me, it has been important to be part of this project, also to think about how through the use of this concept and this research agenda, I can make a very tiny contribution to change the practice in my own discipline, basically. But so linked to that is this idea that, from my perspective, pluralizing social reproduction approaches entails both a form of centering social reproduction, and so, like understanding capitalist life or society and economy starting from social reproduction, but also a form of decentering, so like moving away from certain dominant perspectives and trying to understand how social reproduction is organized across, like a different geographic, historical contexts and so forth. And, Alessandra before mentioned the importance of land, which, if you think about the social reproduction literature on and from and for the global north, there is absolutely nothing on land pretty much, while it is very clear from the literature focused on the global south that land is very central for social reproduction. And even going to the basic point of the interaction between social reproduction and capitalist production, I have the feeling that very often it is assumed that capitalist production comes first and then social reproduction is a sort of residual. While from my perspective, having spent some years studying the organization of everyday life in Mozambique, for example, I would say it's exactly the opposite. Social reproduction is an absolute priority, and then people might engage in capitalist production as a consequence and on the terms that are available to them. So, like this is very key. And so just to conclude, the point about pluralizing social reproduction approaches for me is both, and this is something that we discuss as a group, recognizing that there is already a plurality of these approaches. And it's just, wrong from my perspective to think that everything that is written about social reproduction is reconducible to social reproduction theory, because this is just not what it is, but also to promote an agenda of more and continuing pluralization, because we discover more and more through this type of approach. Yeah, there, thank you. So.
The beauty with hybrid seminars without automatic adjustment, so you still need sort of labor, human labor, down in the machine. Well, it's recently part of the Viva where whoever was speaking, you have the camera moving. That is certainly not the case. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, thank you so much for writing the paper. I mean, that is like it's a brilliant paper. It talks. It's definitely a very agenda setting and talks about very broad issues. It talks about I think not only kind of have implications about how social reproduction is conceptualized and understood, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but also it talks so much about other issues, about methods, about questions of solidarity. So I think it's just like there is, when I was reading it, I was just highlighting everything. I was like, there's lots and lots to talk about. But I think for the purpose of this discussion, I will focus and limit myself to a few points that, just like before I start with that thing, I just like the significance of the key propositions of this paper, which is the significance of location and the significance of looking at social reproductions from like global South locations. That was something that I was like grappling with in my own research. When I was researching on Iran and on trying to look at the sanctions, the crisis induced by sanctions through the lens of social reproduction, I mean, there was a lot of things that didn't make sense with the type of literature that existed, right? And then my kind of way of approaching that was like to bring together literature on feminist post-colonial work and feminist IPE work, because there was, because there was no way of making sense of some stuff, and I'm gonna talk a little bit about that, and then I'll go and towards some questions. So, for example, I think, the very key proposition of this paper is that location matters, and that we have to look at social reproduction from outside of the global north. And obviously, the immediate consequences of that, as soon as you look at social reproductions outside of the north, especially in post-colonial context, you can see that how practices of life making, how governance of social reproduction, organization of social reproductions, how much that is entangled with histories of colonialism and with contemporary forms of geopolitical conflict and global racism. And that was the case in the context of Iran. So a key argument of my work was that over the last decade, in response to sanctions, the Iranian state has started to push women, there is a wide range of interventions in matters of social reproduction, in marriages, divorce, and and family. There is even with the standards of the Iranian state, we see a rise of a very anti-gender agenda. And then to make sense of that why the state trying to push women back to the household, when you look at the underlying discourses, there is a lot about, yes, extraction of women's labor, in the context of crisis, the filling the gaps with the unpaid labor of women. However, it is also a lot about being framed in relation to the specific geopolitical conflict between Iran and the US. Is that pushing for certain types of families is about reproducing certain Islamic ideologies in defiance of Western culture and all of that. And so these geopolitical dimensions, I wanted to make also sense in relation to social reproduction. And these kind of geopolitical dimensions obviously is so much linked to the histories to the Oriental, gendered histories of Orientalism and all of that. So you had to really go into that. The way that the Iranian state is responding to this kind of crisis is so much, and these interventions are kind of justified, is even So I guess this is obviously one of the very key arguments of this paper. That you make it very abundantly clear in the paper, but also in your other work as well. That the social reproduction should be understood in relation, obviously, to logics of capital, labor extraction, accumulation, and all of that, but also in relation to what should be embedded in and seen its entanglements with colonial histories. But I wonder what would you think would be the consequences of this reconceptualization, if you would like it, for the broader debates, for example, when it comes on debates on like value, for example, solidarity, social reproduction value, right? So specifically because I guess I'm asking this question because there is a lot of geopolitical value in for the states, right? It doesn't have only monetary value, and so how that would change the way that we might think about questions of value, and I guess this is quite important to make sense of a lot of stuff that's happening, the rise of anti-gender agendas everywhere in the world. Right now, for example, in the context of the, in the Western context, it's not I started with the Middle East highlighting the importance of geopolitics, but even here, there is a lot of gender, pro-family, crackdown on reproductive rights, and all of that is justified in relation to racist agendas of white women having more white babies, this kind of rhetoric, right? So that geopolitics really matters for thinking about social reproduction. And I wonder, what would be the broader consequences of this debate and how that going to change the way that we might think about some other questions in relation to social reproduction, to question of value, to question of solidarity, to question of how we frame our struggles and demands in relation to social reproduction, right? So, for example, historically, we have examples of wages for housework, but how we gonna you know, how that would impact the way that we, you know, build feminist solidarity around the struggles over social reproduction, if that makes sense. And also, I guess, another kind of comment, question, or something that I really admired about this paper, I think the paper, I mean, you know, thinking about location as location, but not as localizing, you know, by thinking about location as a place that, you know, so location matters not in the sense that we're going to take the theory from the West to the rest, but rather, you know, the location does something to that theory, right? It changes it, and I guess, yeah. So somehow that, you know, that I think something that this paper does, and I really like it. I think it kind of, I mean, it's also like in relation to what Sara, you were saying at the very end about like breaking down social reproduction to like various. I think this paper is like really unsettles the concept of social reproduction in some interesting ways, and it definitely broaden it, but also in you know, it's kind of, you know, I could see that, like, you know, do we need the term social reproduction? Like, what does it doing, right? What is the analytical purchase of the concept, especially because, I mean, usually based on the Western experience, right, we always understand social reproduction as define it as like usually unpaid social reproduction within the household that predominantly done by women, and that's like necessary for the reproduction of life, and you know. However, I mean, something that you have in the paper, you know, you talk about that basically, I mean, this definition relies a lot upon, you know, a type of economy in which spaces of reproduction and production are so clear-cut, like divided, right? It's very much like historically specific to, you know, to Western experience of industrialization and all of that. Yeah. And I wonder, so, and you talk obviously in the paper, which is very, like, you know, totally agree that, like, you know, as soon as you go, like in an agrarian economy, that's not the case in a, let's say in an informal, like in a, you know, in the context of Iran, like informal economy is massive, and households are the spaces of production as well, like, you know, home-based businesses and all of that. And then based on that, you come to the conclusion that the redefining social, or maybe not redefining, but defining it as you say that, and I quote, like, the social reproduction could be understood as a bundle of material practices and forms of work, subsistence and care, unpaid and paid, waged and unwaged, underpinning the existence of all people and all economies and societies as we know them. And so then my question was that, I mean, to me, it seems that pluralizing social reproduction approaches, in a way, it's going so much beyond just the unpaid social reproduction within the household, and it becoming the theory of work in a way. Is it, you know, is a theory of labor? So is it, and then thinking about how labor, care, and exploitation is organized differently in various economies, in the various types of. So yeah, so I just wonder, like, you know, I just wonder what you think about what is social reproduction, right? Is it like, do you think like, yeah, so for example, money generating activities within the household, right, that are very tiny, but they are towards, like, you know, but they want, like, you know, people, like in my research, I was seeing a lot of women doing, like, I don't know, making jams and selling it to neighbors. Type of thing. So, but they are money generate. Are they social reproduction in terms of the materiality of the type of work that we're gonna, you know, and what is, like, you know, what the concept of social reproduction is doing here. Yeah, and then I have one final point, which is not a question, but I thought it was interesting for me. I guess one aspect of, am I on time, or do I have time already?
You're fine.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. So the final thing I wanted to mention is that I guess one aspect of, I mean, for me, one aspect of, which is like one of the, I think the very, very simple and very profound proposition of this paper, that location matters. I think one way that location matters also for me is by thinking about kind of the absences and thinking about what geographies aren't viewed through the lens of social reproduction. And also the wider lexicon of political economy. And I'm talking about that because I work on the Middle East, and it's like a notoriously kind of always studied, perhaps not irrelevant to his stories of Orientalism and all of that. It's like in relation to oftentimes security, death, threat, and very much detached from political economy structure. And as a result, and obviously there's a lot of like amazing work that's not like that, but generally, you know, we see a lot of like work which is, when it comes to gender relations, oftentimes articulates gender oppression in very much, again, detached from these political economy structures. And usually in relation to local structures of culture, like authoritarianism of the state, and you know, there is a sort of like culturalism that we constantly see when it comes to. So I wonder, I mean, and the political result of it is clear. I mean, that is like an agenda. You know, a lot of politics of war and peace towards the Middle East is like relies upon certain types of, you know, understanding of gender relations and all of that. And yeah, and I wonder. So that's like something I just wanted to mention, that like there are like, I think because you discuss in the paper that there are like regions that might have been this, you know, you know, they might not use the terminology, they might, but I feel like the terminology does something as well. It matters because it literally links us quickly to the questions of global inequalities and questions of materiality and all of that. And I guess just like that is one way also for me to think about the question of location, and thinking about what type of political, like how gender and racialized power relations shapes our lexicons, our lenses, with which certain locations, populations are understood, and this topic. And I guess, yeah. Thank you so much.
Well, you to see the questions there. So we're going to take some questions, or do you want to respond first to Osman? Would you like to respond? Yeah? Yeah. Why don't you do that?
This time, reverse order.
So that I get to choose the question. Thank you so much, Asma. That was very, generous of you, like to engage with our paper and share those comments. If okay, I mean, of course, then Shirin and Ale will be able to add, but I'm going to take maybe the second question that you put to us on, do we need the term social reproduction? What is this social reproduction? So I want to say, well, the short answer is yes. I think we do need the social reproduction from my perspective. But let me make maybe a couple of points on this. The first is that much of this, I think it is true. And, Alan and I are doing another project where this is confirmed by looking systematically at a lot of the feminist literature across different disciplines. Even if the definition of social reproduction is always broader than unpaid social reproduction or unpaid social reproductive work, it is true that there has been a tendency in the feminist literature to focus more specifically on unpaid social reproductive work. And I mean, if one wants to do that, of course, there is no problem from my perspective. But I do think that in this sense, recognizing that actually the way in which social reproduction is conceptualized is much bigger than that. So for a start, it includes paid social reproductive work, which is often underpaid, which is another key problem that I think we're dealing with as feminists. But also, like those material social practices that are very central for the regeneration of life in the form of ceremonies and rituals, etc. That sometimes, not all social reproduction scholarship for grants as part of social reproduction. But because most definitions that we have go in that direction, I think that actually the concept is useful precisely to move us beyond an exclusive or narrow focus on unpaid social reproductive work, because I do think that that is necessary. And, indeed, this it's, of course, I mean, I understand your point, like the concept is very broad, but at the same time, it is important to maintain that totality from my perspective, because there are some, themes or processes that really connect it all together. So, like the systemic devaluation of any kind of social reproduction work, whether it is unpaid or underpaid, for example, or the neglect of the importance of certain forms of work and social practices as fundamental for the regeneration of life. I think it's a cross-cutting theme that keeps all of these different components of social reproduction together. And so, it is important to recognize that. But also one last thing, I very much agree with your point that in certain societies, such as the one where we are, currently in, the compartmentalization of social reproduction and capitalist production, for example, is much more visible. This is not something that I think, describes the reality that I try to understand and study in Mozambique, for example, where this compartmentalization is much more blurred and more complex and, it's just more complex. And so in that sense, I would think about social reproduction and capitalist production not as separate domains, but as domains that have areas of overlap and also, I'm a follower of syndicates. So, in dialectical relation, and there are areas of mutual constitution and tension in that sense. And I think that social reproduction approaches are precisely about highlighting those interactions. And this is what that's why I think that the concept is useful.
Great, thank you. Do you want to all answer to this now, or do you want to take some questions from
I'll
the?
just be far briefer.
Yeah, sure.
I'll just thank you so much for the reading and the points raised, which I think are very relevant. Just say that surely it's not a different theory of labor per se, but it leads to a different theorization of labor and laboring for sure. If you flip that view that starts from life as opposed to, and not just in relation to reproductive work, but more generally, it takes us away from the fetishization of wage labor as the key aspect of capitalist development, and instead he appears as one of the instances in which exploitation manifests. Well, of course, if you open up to a reproductive view, and from a global reproductive view centered on the global south, of course, you can make sense of a lot of way of laboring and a lot of forms of exploitation that exceed wage work, which actually are by and large the lion's share of how we labor on Earth. So these are ILO sort of, and I would say perhaps conservative measures, that 69% of the global south labor informally, and 61% of the entire planet labors informally. So it's necessary to really focus on how it is that we do things. So it does lead to a theory of how to make a theory of labor otherwise. And of course, with the implications on value, which I would not bore you with because I've been obsessed with it for 5 years. So let's move on. But instead, I want to say something on politics, because I think on geopolitics, which we touched little upon in general, but in the paper there is more. I do think he also does provide key insights on how to understand geopolitics and its reproductive aspects, also looking at the tensions between different aspirations or different projects of social reproduction overall. And we study the most obvious, which is like global care chains, the way in which reproductive labor is reorganized globally with the in-sources of reproductive work from the global south, but with reference to security and with reference to, for instance, different projects, different societal views on what social reproduction should be about, you really see it sometimes as clashing between the global north and the global south. For instance, this obsession with fertility rates in certain regions, and the fact that a lot of good feminist energy, sadly, is focused on, you know, this obsession with fertility rates, also in well-meaning ways, as lower fertility rates as an outcome of precarity, for instance, as a classic in the European sort of debate, and how this instead conceal forms of racism, or it works through forms of racism that deny the reproductive aspiration or the reproductive needs of other states or other contexts. So that is also seen social reproduction. The need to pluralize social reproduction allows you to see this tension between different reproductive projects and to understand the way in which the women's rights agenda might be hijacked by racist forces, or might be sort of this idea of fertility. It can be used against migration to harden borders, and so on and so forth. So I think it's something very interesting that lies there in terms of how you make the concept very sort of productive from a point of view of engaging with geopolitics. I just, of course, the work of Sara Farris on femonationalism comes to mind, right? So you use reproductive agendas against the reproductive needs and objectives of other populations. Yeah.
Very interesting. Questions from the audience? I have one online that I would like to get to, so while you're thinking of your questions. So this is from Jamila, and Jamila is working with women in Mozambique, resisting impacts of gas extractive industry. In my work, she says, I want to highlight resistance, not as organizational or direct opposing to industry, but solidarity as support networks that these women create within themselves, and in which strategies of reciprocity, redistribution, and non-market provisioning are ways of resistance to, I think, material precarity in a context of extractive industry and absence of welfare state. Her question is, if you can see that broadening social reproduction theory would also include this way of resistance, and she specifically says maybe Shirin would answer this because you commented on how social reproduction unfolds in the everyday.
Yeah. Nobody else has a question, so
Go ahead with that one.
there will come. I think that's a really important point in terms of, I've been thinking just this conversation and also Asma's comments about how we can also pluralize location, you know, not in terms of like that geographies, but as Alice said, sort of, you know, geopolitics, as you have said, Sara, about sort of, you know, areas of research which are sort of locational in certain ways, which is land. And this falls very much in that sense. So I've done some work on extractivism, land, and social reproduction, or rather the reproduction or threats to the reproduction of everyday life, right? So in the context of South Africa and the Kolobeni, which I think Shirin Hassim and Beth Goldblatt have also written a really lovely piece on. And this is about sort of course, at one level, we can just say, oh, well, it's a developmental story. So the South African state wants mining for development. And the indigenous people of sort of, you know, of the Kolobeni, they don't. But it's much, much richer if you put a social reproductive lens on it, in Alice's words, because it shows extractivism to be, on the one hand, definitely entangled very deeply with capitalism and developmentalism, actually. But at the same time, it is also generative of this new way of thinking about. It's not that these people are anti-development, but they want it to be development on their own terms, in their own location, so that they are not displaced. And they're sort of, Sara, very well, you sort of mentioned, which Catherine and I have written about sort of, you know, what do we understand about social reproduction? It is also reproduction of culture and ideologies, right? Which stabilize capitalism in some ways, but challenge it in other ways. And so it is that dialogue which we really need, because that unfolds in the everyday. And so for these Kolobeni people sort of resisting every day this with multiple strategies. So it's not just going and campaigning, it's not just going and demonstrating, it's not just taking the state to the company to court, so legal strategies, but it is a combination of all this. But the final point I'll say there is, I'm also very interested in terms of activism and resistance, as I think was Bernice Reagan, in what are the costs of that? Especially if you don't have a redistributive agenda in terms of the unpaid labor at home, or paid labor but poorly paid labor in reproducing surrogate. So who's doing this activism? Who is risking their lives, very often their lives? In this case, there have been violent attacks on these. So I think the question that is raised by Jamila is a really important one. There are no simple answers to it, but I think we need to connect activism, resistance, and change with also the costs of social reproduction and the cost and the entanglements of capitalism.
Just depleting.
Which is depleted, definitely.
Any questions from the floor yet? Because I have one line, if not. Anyone? Yes? Please introduce yourself when you speak.
Okay, my name is Claire Hall, and I'm writing my PhD, putting a social reproduction lens on children working in the leather industry in Dhaka, Bangladesh, where I didn't really get the opportunity to see resistance there in a very, and what now everybody knows to be a very repressive regime. And my question isn't looking at that at all, but as I'm writing up and coming to my conclusions, I want to ask the panel if we're looking at the inevitability of a basic income to address those inequalities.
Great question. Can I give you one more from now they're coming thick and fast online. So I'm going to give you two more, and then I'm afraid we're going to, after you've answered, we have to close because we're supposed to get out. So your last chances are now. So Pragga Roy asks, she says, I'm looking at how pregnancy is work for socioeconomically marginalized communities, specifically urban poor Dalit women in India. I'm using social reproduction theory, but even with the global south, I see most of the theorizing and storytelling is done by dominant caste groups. How do we pluralize SRT then, even within global south locations? Ananda Mukherjee says, the paper has been so enlightening and I'm so privileged to be part of the discussion. Two questions or sort of reflection. You're going to have to be very brief in your answers, everyone. Given that unpaid and unfree labor cannot be theorized solely as a gendered product of domestic labor, how can we address the shifting labor dynamics in the global south, where the increasing presence of a superfluous surplus production population has made labor increasingly reproductive? Does this transformation blur or redefine gendered roles within laboring families? If you can throw some light on that, she asks. Secondly, if we articulate value generation and extraction from reproductive labor as a class process, it seems to dissolve the noun form of the laborer as a fixed subject with a defined location. It's a very long question. If labor is increasingly mobile and dispersed, circulating rather than concentrated, does this lead to a political impasse? How can we theorize collective political agency when labor is in a constant vortex? And Ananda is a PhD student at SOAS. Okay, who wants to take those very good questions? Sarah, maybe you should talk to the one about pregnancy as labor.
I've been quite lucky so far, but it's starting to feel definitely like work. No, if you don't mind, maybe I'll provide a very brief answer to the next to last question on shifting labor dynamics in the global south. So I think, different points have been made in our conversation so far, but I think that this is where a social reproduction approach can be very powerful. Precisely because the fact that many laborers in the global south are either in the informal economy or, some people exactly would use the language of a surplus population to refer to these people. Ale was making the point that in fact the wage work is no longer a dominant form of work for the laboring classes of the world, and particularly in the global south, but is becoming increasingly the case also in the global north through the expansion of the gig economy and so forth. So I think that this is where, the picture becomes a very blurred and complex. And it's always been part of the feminist project to go beyond binaries, right? So we've always been saying, there is no dichotomy between the public and the private, between productive and reproductive. And this is part of it, right? Like in a world where the world of work has become incredibly complex, and where, in fact, as I was saying earlier, I think in peripheral context of the global south, social reproduction imperatives and the difficulties and the challenges that people go through in order to meet these imperatives is a top priority in the organization of everyday life. And then, once this, might be carried out, then one might think about engaging in other forms of work that might, fit more into the realm of capitalist production. So, I think, it's not that we have a full analysis of all of these realities yet, but I think that this is the potential of social reproduction approaches to enable this analysis of this changing world of work in this direction. Yeah.
My God, I don't remember half of them. Okay, I just answered to the ones I remember. I'm sorry.
You just answered
Basically. Well, first, the one on pregnancy, of course, that would be more labor for more. Well, first it's literally labor, but it's more so, of course, for poorer classes and poorer castes. This has always been the case because, of course, you have less reliance on the state, less reliance on social contributions, less reliance on pretty much everything. I think the issue of who theorizes what, of course, has to start from the fact that theorizing in itself, in whichever form, is a form of privilege. We all need to start from that and accept that. I do understand the debate around positionality, but to be honest, to be in the position to theorize about processes is a privileged position in and on itself, and I think we need to all grapple with that and do the best we can based on that knowledge. Then, of course, there is the issue of to what extent the social reproduction will be sort of reclaimed by, from subject locations which are less privileged. That is yet to be seen. I think there is evidence, for instance, from the Black feminist scholarships in the US that this can be done very powerfully. But at the same time, I don't think the project should be one to sort of mainstream social reproduction to everything, or that being the primary locus of theorization. That it might be one of articulation instead, or like listening and conversation that might be more important overall. And I think, for instance, these thoughts, when I think about the decolonial debate, right? I don't feel that I need to embrace as a white woman decolonial frameworks, which are embodied by the very definition of decolonial frameworks. Sometimes the most progressive thing you can do to keep a place or a space progressive is to make yourself scarce, okay? When you don't embody that space, but instead that can be the starting point for a different type of theorization and a different type of dialogue, I would say. And then there is the question on labor. Well, I always get these questions about all this process of pluralization of laborers, that takes away the very few realms of security and comfort we have in political economy. But actually, this realm of security and comfort cost us very dearly. and they overrepresented certain categories as expressions of the laboring class while completely erasing others. And I think this has a knock-on effect on political imagination. So that doesn't give us this stability, this narrowness, has never given us anything but the possibility to only look at potential for revolutions or disruptions in very narrow ways. The more the workers is everywhere, the more it's mobile, and the more I cannot pin it down there, the better it is, because it means that the revolution can actually start from anywhere, right? It's like any place is as good as, and you have a multiplication of revolutionary subjects, which is exciting, because I don't have to wait for, you know, the people to organize only in that specific form. I can instead open up my eyes and my political imaginary from the fact that perhaps change can happen from many different places, even ones that we sort of can't even imagine. And it has across the history of capitalism, it has come from everywhere.
On that extremely positive and hopeful and exciting note, I think we have to close. Thank you so much. This was brilliant. Thank you.